Season 3 we have not seen yet here, and from what we heard, the first. It's going to start airing in the fall in the UK. So
that's right. Yeah, we have a very tight production turnaround in the UK. We start storylining in sort of November, December of last year. We start shooting in March. We shoot all the way through until October, but it starts transmitting in September. So we're filming and shooting at the same time, and then we're usually in post-production whilst we're in pre-production of the next series. So we're in a constant kind of Merlin circle. So it's always entertaining. There's never a dull moment.
Do you have it mapped out? You know where the story ends up.
Yeah.
King Arthur and Merlin as his wizard. Do you have it mapped out in the long term as to how you're going to get there?
Well, I mean, when we originally started storylining it, we thought of the series to begin with in a 5-year plan, and so we have each series we have iconic Arthurian legend moments that we work towards. We sort of and so we use that. We slowly bleed in the Arthurian legend. So we have kind of like milestones every so often. So series 3 we knew would start with we wanted to deal with the Morgana story at the beginning of series 3, and then we have a kind of sort of a few iconic kind of Arthurian legend moments that we're going to end the series with. So we sort of know that, we kind of roughly know where we want to take each character, and then the rest of it sort of evolves in quite an organic process. We sort of we think each week it's very important that each week we tell a self-contained story. When we were developing the series, it was very much about we want mini action adventure movies that will appeal cross generation, and then we will build in a little bit of serial arc, but the emphasis was on mini action adventure movies. But we do, in mine and Julian's minds, we have specific moments that we need to reach to at certain points in the series.
In creating the series, what did you want to bring to your take on Arthurian legend that sort of that differentiates it from previous tellings?
Well, I mean, I think to us the fact that the magic was banned was sort of nice, because I guess what we were interested in is telling the story of the unsung hero, and having young Merlin and him dealing with the destiny. And I think that's always sort of storytellers telling the story of a young person with an extraordinary destiny, and how they cope with that, and how they cope with what their destiny expects of them, whilst at the same time having to cope with just being a human being. It's always an interesting story to us. So we really kind of like that. And I guess we wanted to sort of inject a bit of fun into it as well, and have fun with the Arthurian legend, and not, lots of the other Merlin stories that take themselves terribly seriously. Whereas to us it was very important that even though we told big epic stories of life and death and people laying down their lives for each other, and we had all of that, whilst at the same time we wanted to really undercut that with a lot of fun and humour.
As the casting process, going back in time, who was the hardest person to cast?
I think it's always really difficult to cast all the young actors. We were very much, we didn't want to cast names in any of the 4 young roles. We wanted to discover new acting talent. At the time we were pretty certain that we'd be able to secure a well-known actor for the part of the guys. So we were under no pressure from the network to find a young famous person. So I think that was the challenge, is finding working with young actors, because they can come into castings and they're very, very nervous. So you have to keep bringing them back. And I think also in a high concept show, you're finding British actors that can deal with high concept worlds. It's very difficult because British actors are very much ingrained into naturalism and sort of that kind of kitchen sink drama. So for them to be able to deal with a high concept world which is extraordinary, and find that right acting style, which American actors do far better than English actors, that was very hard. And I think also all of those parts are difficult. I mean Merlin and Arthur were very, very difficult parts to cast. Arthur, I kind of knew who I wanted because I'd worked with Bradley James before, and I knew that he had great comedy and warmth, and that's what I wanted. Merlin was very difficult because you want an actor that has a huge playing range, that can be really emotional, play big, intense, emotional scenes, but at the same time he's got to have a lot of humour and be funny, and most important of all, he's got to be really likeable. If you don't like this actor, then you might as well go home. So it was trying to find an actor that filled all of those demands. And we saw Colin about, God knows, poor guy, pulled him in about 20 times.
Wow.
And we just kept on auditioning him and re-auditioning. And he was an extraordinary actor. He hadn't done much before. He'd done a couple of small telly roles, and then and a couple of stage plays. So he was really right at the beginning of his journey as an actor. But there was something extraordinary about his acting ability, which Julian and I recognised. But again, that kind of likability thing, we were very worried about, because we've cast lots of other shows where we've cast the lead person, and actually the audience didn't respond to them that well. So that's always the big risk and the big kind of stress, is how are they going to look on screen? Will the audience like them? Well, we had an instinct that people would like Colin, and unfortunately, thank God, it worked out brilliantly, and he was this, hugely likeable character, and the British audience responded very warmly to him. So it was a huge sigh of relief.
And Anthony Stewart Head?
Yeah.
Was he your choice?
Yeah, I mean he was way up on the top of our casting list. The great thing about Anthony is that he's worked on high concept shows before. I don't know if you've heard of the show called Buffy.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. It was quite a good show. Yeah, you should watch it. And he, I was a big fan of Buffy, obviously, and loved Tony. And Tony's just very good at that kind of acting. He just has a way of dealing with that dialogue and making it feel very real, whilst at the same time just that little twinkle in his eye, and you can have fun with it as well. And Uther is a very difficult part, because what you don't want, and Tony and I talk about this a lot, you don't want just the Queen of Hearts, you don't want somebody just constantly shouting. And Uther is a far more complex character than that. He thinks he's doing the right thing. To be a leader, you've got to have a certain set of rules. And it was great, and it was a real coup to have Tony. We sent him the scripts, and he said yes, and we were sort of really, hugely excited to be, working with him. But don't tell him I said that.
Traditionally, in almost every other tale about the Arthurian tales, there's not a lot about young Merlin. Merlin comes into the scene as kind of this already fully realized character. Did you pull anywhere for inspiration for Merlin's backstory for the journey that he's going to go on through the show?
Well, we just. I think that what we, like I was saying earlier, I think that we just liked the idea of a young man that doesn't realise his destiny, his future, that he is the kind of downtrodden, rejected person that nobody appreciates. And I think that was our sort of starting point, is to make him sort of gauche and lovable and ordinary. And I think that was just that it was all about subjecting the everybody expects Merlin to be this amazing wise wizard, so let's do the subvert that expectation and make him sort of very naive, sweet, innocent, and not aware of his potential. So that was always our starting point, and then the writers discovered this great voice for him, and made him sort of fallible and human and likeable. So I think it was taking everything that this says about Merlin and the legend and doing the opposite, I guess. So you looked at everything and went, right, let's put that to one side and let's do this.
What created that desire to see that side?
I guess it was that. I don't know. I suppose as a storyteller, I'm always fascinated in telling the story of the supposedly normal person, but who has something extraordinary. So it's playing around with somebody that has to be, has to deal with being a teenager and all those problems. And God, don't we all know there are loads. Whilst at the same time dealing with the fact that he has magic and a huge responsibility to save Camelot and to look after Prince Arthur. So you've got these two parallel stories running side by side. And that coping with being a teenager is actually just as hard as having to save Arthur from a dragon. And I think, to me, there's something really nice and human about that extraordinary thing and that human thing, and running those two stories in parallel.
The show.
Go ahead.
Because still sticking with the same thing, the show's kind of been described as a Smallville take on the Arthurian mythos. I mean, was that like a conscious choice on your part, or is that just how the critics have kind of dubbed it?
Well, no, I mean, I think we were. I was a huge fan of Smallville, and I thought what they did was very, very clever. So, in lots of ways, I think that subconsciously sort of, inspired us in that, we saw how cleverly they did that, and to us it was, about recreating the legend, before they were famous, basically. And so, and the way that Smallville did it, it was kind of an inspiration in lots of ways, I think, because it was just so very, the first series was just very clever in the way that you had, Lex Luthor, he's going to be evil, but actually he's, comes across as being really, really nice. And that was the same sort of the idea that we had as well. Here's Morgana. If you know anything about Arthurian legend, you know that she is basically unbelievably evil and is part of Arthur's downfall.
Right.
So let's meet her and she's very, very likable, has problems, but has a huge warm heart. And then then tell the story of how that is destroyed and how she turns to the dark side.